Early in August, the Third Army, moving eastward from Naval, reached Le Mans, a town only 175 kilometers southwest of Paris. One afternoon, a courier from London arrived hurriedly at our command post near Stahl-Lendelen. He was clutching a sealed envelope. The unbuttoned pocket of his military jacket was tightly stuffed with documents certifying that their holder had special powers. These documents had secured the courier a seat on a plane travelling across the Channel. Sen tore open the envelope and pulled out a miniature American flag. A business card fell to the floor. For General Bradley's jeep, on the liberation of Paris, read the note enclosed. The courier had been sent by Major Robert Cohen of Boston, a vigorous, small-sized officer of the quartermaster's service. He had met me on my first arrival in London, and instead of greeting me, he had taken a measure of me. Henceforth, I was to have all the uniforms that could be required sewn to this measure. At his desk in Major General Robert Littlejohn's office in London, Cohen caught the fever that gripped the American army as it approached Paris. For a generation raised on tales of their father's legendary exploits in World War I, Paris held a special appeal. Tactically, however, it was of no value. This city, glorious in the past, was only a small spot on our operational maps, and we had to bypass it, moving eastwards towards the Rhine. The liberation of Paris might have stumped our supply men, for behind its beautiful facades lived 4 million hungry Frenchmen. Sending food to Paris would have complicated our already overloaded supply lines. Supplying Paris with food would have meant reducing the supply of petrol to the front. A few days before the enemy launched his offensive in the Mortagne area, I checked again our prospective plan for the liberation of Paris. Some staff officers believed that the Germans would definitely try to save Paris from destruction and declare it an open city, as the French had done in 1940. I did not share this view. According to our information, the enemy had concentrated large food supplies in Paris, and if this was so, he had no choice but to defend the city. However, this did not mean that we had to encircle the city and begin a siege. We developed a plan for a wide bypass of Paris from the south, then expected to turn north, to connect with the troops covering the city from the north and cut off the German garrison escape routes to the territory of the Reich, seeking to reach the border sign Orleans. We developed a plan to throw airborne landing in the vicinity of the city of Chartres, famous for its cathedrals. In this case, we proceeded from the assumption that the enemy will create a defensive line from Cayenne to the south in the direction of the Loire. Having broken through this line, the Third Army will make a rush north of the Loire and join the landing force, thrown in Chartres. By 10 August, the plan for the airborne operation was already drawn up. A week later, we proposed its cancellation. The enemy failed to create a new defensive line. Moreover, the command of the Third Army said that the army can go to the line seen Orleans without the help of airborne troops. The cancellation of the airborne operation in the Chartres area allowed the use of transport aircraft to carry supplies to the Third Army. The day of 19 August was marked for Patton's army by the opening of unscheduled airlift. On that day, 21 C-47s delivered 47 tons of food to airfields near Le Mans. Already at this time, we were beginning to experience fuel and ammunition shortages that were slowing the pace of our advance, and the airlift was to be the key to success in our bitter struggle for supplies. After a few days, the pace of our offensive was no longer determined by the strength of enemy resistance, but by the amount of supplies delivered to the Allied forces. By 21 August, the Third Army had forced the Seine north and south of Paris. The enemy, still west of the Seine, was making every effort to break away from the First Army, whose troops were stretched along the left bank of the Seine towards Rouen. In a last desperate attempt to save his demoralized troops, von Kluge gave orders to break into small groups and infiltrate through our lines. Then, unable to survive the disaster of which Hitler was the culprit, the German field marshal committed suicide. Patton had not yet had time to force the Seine, and already a delegation of correspondents came to me with a request not to expose Paris to artillery fire, despite the fact that in the city remained a German garrison. Although I did not share their love for a city I had never had to visit, I assured the correspondents that we would not damage a single cobblestone in its streets. Instead of breaking into the city through the western gate, I explained, "We shall first take Paris in a pincer, and then enter its streets whenever we please." "Which division will take the city?" questioned one of the correspondents. "They all fought well," I answered, trying to evade a direct answer. "It will be difficult for us to make our choice." If you're allowed to nominate candidates, he laughed. Consider that one vote has already been cast in favor of the first one. Why don't you take the city yourself? I suggested. You have enough correspondence for that. Seriously, you can take it whenever you like and save us a lot of trouble. I may confess that we are by no means anxious to liberate Paris now, though I beg you not to pass my words on to the French. In the 4 weeks since the Normandy breakthrough, American supply lines have stretched from Scio to the Seine. Now the supply of the pre-bridge fortification of the Third Army southeast of Paris depended on the highway 400 kilometers from the port of Cherbourg. Advancing, we too quickly overcame all the lines of enemy resistance, which were taken into account when planning the pace of advance of our rear. Moreover, the number of troops receiving supplies by the above-mentioned highway from Cherbourg was increasing from day to day with the general accumulation of our forces. And ahead of us was an outbreak of petrol starvation, which stopped our tanks a few kilometers from the Siegfried. The railways had been restored to Le Mans, 225 kilometers east of Cherbourg, but the repair of bridges destroyed by bombs was extremely slow. There was a shortage of engineering and construction battalions. The extreme wear and tear of the rolling stock of the French railways caused interruptions in the work of railway transport. At the same time, railway trains, specially formed in England, and railway equipment were waiting for their turn to be loaded in English ports, giving way to trucks. We compensated for the lack of railway transport by lorries. These 2.5-ton capacity machines knew no rest. Having transported troops and supplies to the front line, they would immediately return for a new load. More and more vehicles were needed to meet our needs, which were growing daily, and we even began to take vehicles from the new divisions arriving at Cherbourg and put them into convoys. But even these extreme measures would not have helped us to delay the supply crisis until September if we had not cut supplies to the armies and organized air transport. In the meantime, we could only move eastwards at the cost of extreme strain on all our logistics, and I feared that the liberation of Paris would disrupt our entire supply system. Every ton of food arriving in that city meant that the front would receive 1 ton less ammunition or fuel. The chief of the military administration section of the Army Group, headquarters, Key 5, estimated that in the first time Parisians would need at least 4,000 tons of various cargoes per day. It would be good if Paris tightened its belt and lived with the Germans a little longer. After all, each saved 4,000 tonnes provided a 3-day march of motorized units towards the German border. But deprived of its dairy base in Normandy and cut off from the grain areas of France, Paris had exhausted all available supplies. Our agents reported a growing food crisis. Intending to create an inviolable reserve in case of the capture of Paris, we sent a radiogram to the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces on 20 August, demanding that 3,000 tons of food be sent to us by air. However, despite the threat of starvation in Paris, I was determined not to deviate from the plan. If we can collapse on the Siegfried line, not lacking in supplies, it will bring the war to a close and reward Paris for an extra week of occupation. But we did not take into account the impatience of the Parisians, who had been waiting for 4 years for the Allied armies to finally approach the gates of their city. My plan to take Paris in pincers burst at the airfield near Laval on the morning of 23 August. Already on 7 August, Paris began to show feverish anxiety over the approach of the armies of liberation. On that day, the tanks of the 7th American Division rumbled over the cobblestones of Chartres, and the Gestapo in Paris hurriedly loaded into cars in preparation for evacuation. Ariel Nordling, who had served as Swedish Consul General in Paris for 18 years, had managed to secure the release of 4,213 political prisoners from the city jail that morning alone. Fearing that the Gestapo would rather execute all the prisoners than agree to their release, Nordling, as a representative of a neutral country, had visited Otto Abetz, Hitler's ambassador to France, a few days earlier. He had warned the German proconsul that the Gestapo atrocities in Paris would make the judgment of the peoples after the war even more ruthless. Nonsense, mechericht Abetz, furious at the interference Nordling. We never killed political prisoners. Then, as if reprimanding the Swede for his impertinence, the ambassador added, "The situation on the fronts has been restored. We are not going to leave Paris and are not preparing for evacuation." Urged by the sharp reply of Gaulieta, Nordling turned to Laval, who was then in Paris. But this collaborator, aged from anxiety apparently, was more concerned only about his own fate and not at all interested in the request of the consul. Having achieved nothing from Laval, Nordling left him alone with his anxious thoughts. With the help of an Austrian who was said to be sympathetic to the French resistance movement, Nordling succeeded in obtaining an audience with General Dietrich von Holtitz, the chief of the German garrison in Paris. The general calmly listened to Nordling. As commander, I cannot interfere in the fate of civilians. Perhaps they will be sent to Germany for safety. But there are no more trains from Paris, the Swedish consul objected sharply. You can't take the prisoners to Germany? Why don't you hand them over to the Swiss government or to my government? We will guarantee that they will not raise arms against you. Von Holtitz wrinkled his nose in displeasure. No, he replied with some confusion. I can't do that. In order to release these prisoners, I must receive an order to that effect. He looked at Nordling for a moment, then said slowly, Now, if you give me 5 German prisoners of war for each prisoner, I will release them to you. But you know I have nothing to do with prisoners of war, Nordling began. Well, let's put it all down on paper. The exchange that von Holtitz was proposing was not in doubt. The German commandant soothed his conscience and kept his head. Nordling shrugged his shoulders in silence and drew up a document with a heavy heart, in which his word of honour to obtain the surrender of 5 German prisoners of war in exchange for each Frenchman released. The exchange was fixed for the 17th of August, but on the evening of that day the warden became obstinate and refused to release his charges. If I let them out, they would be in violation of the siege order, he explained. Nordling agreed to wait until morning, but in the morning the warden hesitated again. This time he doubted the rightness of his actions. The prisoners' pocket money had been taken when they were arrested, and by law they could not be released until the money was returned. Unfortunately, the warden had no cash funds available. Nordling hurried to the bank, took 700,000 francs from the account of the Swedish consulate, and gave it to the German. The commandant returned the money to the prisoners and opened the prison doors to them. By this time, underground units of the French resistance movement had begun to fire on German patrols. Street fighting ensued, fearing that the chief of the German garrison would resort to reprisals. The headquarters of the resistance movement sent one of its representatives, Alexandre de Saint-Phal, to the Swedish consul to inform him of its fears. If the street fighting became spontaneous, Paris might become a battlefield and suffer unnecessary destruction. If only the enemy could be persuaded of the hopelessness of his situation, a truce could be concluded and the city saved. When the street fighting began to take on a spontaneous character on the morning of 19 August, Nordling went again to von Holtitz's headquarters at the Hotel Maurice. He found the general in a depressed state of mind. The revolution in Paris has begun, declared Holtitz. I must order my self-propelled guns to march out and attack the police prefecture. Von Holtitz's gaze slid over the Tuileries Gardens and the Place de la Concorde and stopped at the bridge over the Seine. I am sorry that things have turned out this way, he said. Since Stalingrad I've been unlucky. I've always had to defend the rear of the German army, and every time I was ordered to destroy the city I was leaving behind. He grinned sardonically and turned to Nordling. Now I shall go down in history as the man who destroyed Paris. But it is not at all your duty to destroy Paris, Nordling objected. Of course the people rose up, but not against you. The people rose against the Pétain government. Von Holtitz replied caustically, Yes, against the Pétain government. But the trouble is that it is shooting at my soldiers. The general shook his head and looked again towards the Seine. All this can only end in the destruction of Paris. No longer doubting that the German was not happy with the mission assigned to him, Nordling made an attempt to buy time. Don't do it, he begged. Wait until I have consulted with the leaders of the resistance movement. The leaders of the resistance movement, also concerned that French action might force von Holtitz to carry out Hitler's orders and destroy the city, agreed to negotiate a truce with the Germans through Nordling. Street fighting was momentarily suspended, but on Sunday 20 August it broke out again. On this day, separate groups of French partisans opened fire on German troops. This time von Holtitz gave the French an ultimatum. Either the attacks will stop, or he will give the order to bomb Paris. At the same time, he would proceed to execute the order regarding the most ruthless destruction of the city. The leaders of the resistance movement had no means of communication, and the need to quickly transmit the ceasefire order put them in a difficult position. Nordling suggested installing loudspeakers on the lorries and thus communicating the terms of the truce to the general population of the city. The German commandant of Paris recognized the government put forward by the rebels, and the French made only one commitment: to stop firing at the German troops. The noisy crowds of Parisians received the message with enthusiasm, and the flags of the Allied powers appeared in the streets. But the armistice was again disrupted when Paris was flooded with underground communist newspapers urging Parisians not to enter into an agreement with the boss. To the barricades. The old battle cry rang out again in the streets. Officers did not take long to respond. He stopped the distribution of food to the population, but the leadership of the resistance movement was no longer able to force the French to honour the terms of the truce. In turn, von Holtetz was powerless to restrain his troops. He decided that he had no choice but to carry out the order he had received. "I will never surrender to an irregular army," he declared. This remark did not escape Nordling's notice. If the German commandant does not want to deal with the irregular army, then maybe he will enter into negotiations with the Allied army. The consul volunteered to liaise with the Allies and suggest that the Americans enter the city, which would give von Holtetz the opportunity to surrender the French capital with honour. Von Holtetz accepted the Swedes' offer. He even expressed his willingness, for security reasons, to send an officer to lead the delegates through the German lines. On Tuesday evening, a strange group of people secretly gathered in the consulate building. By this time, the 62-year-old Nordling had fallen ill, and his brother Rolf, a French subject, was chosen to head the delegation. In addition to him, the delegation included 4 people: de Saint-Phal, a representative of the National Liberation Committee in Paris, the mysterious Mr. Armo from the British Intelligence Service, a certain Jean Laurent, who introduced himself as a former cabinet secretary under General de Gaulle, and an Austrian anti-fascist. Laurent's credentials seemed suspicious, and he was only enrolled in the delegation after an English agent vouched to him. In a small consular Citroën car with Swedish and white flags, the delegation left Paris via Versailles, accompanied by a German staff car in which rode German officer Hermann Bender, who had accompanied the parliamentarians on von Holtetz's orders. Shortly after 7 o'clock in the evening, they arrived at the location of a German outpost near Trappes on the road to Rambouillet. Here they were stopped by an SS captain and listened with a stony face to the German officer who reported the instructions they had received. "To 20 July, said the captain. "We are not obliged to obey certain German generals." He arrested the delegation and went to Versailles for confirmation of the order he had received. An hour and a half later, the cautious captain returned. He summoned a liaison motorcyclist and instructed him to give the German batteries in front the order to let the car pass. Already at dusk, the delegation car drove with every precaution into the village of Neauphilet-Vieux. Not a single shot was fired, and no one stopped the car with the Swedish flag when it appeared in the location of the American troops. In the centre of the village, Rolf Nordling came across an American Sherman tank, the crew of which was so absorbed in celebrating their victory that they paid no attention to the strange vehicle. Rolf Nordling, somewhat puzzled by this indifference, sought out the tank commander. "I have an assignment to General Eisenhower," he explained. "What general?" snorted the sergeant. "Come with me to our regimental commander." Late in the evening, Nordling and his companions were questioned by a captain on duty in the intelligence department of the corps. Only after the English agent certified his identity, the captain's suspicions fell away and he let them go. This time Nordling found that he was being taken to Patton's 3rd Army headquarters, stationed southwest of Chartres. On Wednesday morning, 8 August, Patton listened to Nordling's proposal. "He called me just as I was leaving Laval on my way to Wyke's command post. George loaded the members of the delegation into aeroplanes and took them to the airfield where I was waiting for them. As soon as the Chief of Intelligence verified the veracity of the words of Rolf Nordling, I called the Chief of Operations and gave the 2nd French Armoured Division orders to immediately march on Paris. At the same time, from the south was to come from the 4th American Infantry Division. I got on the plane and hurried to Granville to report on the measures I took Wyke. The 2nd French Armoured Division, manned by Frenchmen from North Africa and refugees in England, had American tanks. The division fought bravely at Argentan, where it held a bulge in the front line of Patton's army for a fortnight. Its much-respected commander, the celebrated Major General Jacques Leclerc, was captured by the Germans in 1940 but escaped. In 1943 in Libya, He led a group of troops from Fort Lamy across the Sahara to link up with Montgomery's 8th Army at Tripoli. The name Leclerc was an alias taken by the general to shield his family, who remained in German-occupied France, from persecution. An excellent tanker, Leclerc had already made an attempt to liberate Paris on his own initiative. As the 5th Corps took up positions at Argentan, Corps Commander Guerrero spotted French reconnaissance tanks moving east. "Where the hell are you guys going?" Guerrero asked the column commander. Paris, isn't it?" replied the French captain cheerfully. Guerrero cursed and turned the tanks back, ordering them not to leave their positions again. It would have been much easier for me to send any number of American divisions to Paris, but I deliberately chose French units. I wanted to help the French regain their spirits after 4 years of occupation. Certain regiments with tricolor flags on their turrets moved on Paris. Remembering Leclerc's first attempt to slip into Paris, Levy Allen laughed. These Frenchmen," he said, "will enter the city from the west side, but mark my words, they will never leave it from the east side." Allen's words proved almost prophetic. Within a week we were looking for Leclerc's tanks in all the alleys of Paris. I even had to threaten to disband the division to force it to march again. Leclerc was ordered on 22 August to march immediately, but it was not until the next morning that the order was executed. For the next 24 hours, the French 2nd Armoured Division slowly made its way through the crowds of Frenchmen. All along the way the population greeted it with wine and raucous cheers. I could not condemn the French soldiers for responding to the cheers of their countrymen, but neither could I wait for them to parade through to Paris. We had to fulfill the terms of the agreement with von Holtitz. To hell with prestige. I finally said to Allen, "Give the order to the 4th Division to march and liberate the city." Having learned of this order and afraid for the honour of France, Leclerc's tankers got into their vehicles and quickly moved forward. At 10 p.m. on 24 August, Captain Dronnet of the French 2nd Armoured Division lined up a division of light tanks and a company of infantry in front of the Hôtel de Ville. The next morning, 25 August, the French platoon arrived at the Hôtel de Meurice, where the headquarters of the German garrison chief was located. On the first floor, von Holtitz assembled all his officers with the apparent intention of surrendering. French soldiers threw 3 smoke grenades into the hotel lobby, and the Germans came out with their hands up. They were taken to the Montparnasse railway station, where von Holtitz officially surrendered Paris to the French. He sent German officers with white flags to parts of the garrison to inform them of the surrender. That evening Paris began to celebrate its liberation. During the first 2 weeks after the breakthrough of the German defences in Normandy, the actions of the 8th Army were under strict censorship control. By concealing the strength and composition of our right flank grouping, we hoped to mislead the enemy about our intentions. If Hitler knew that Patton's tanks were outflanking von Kluge's flank, he might have abandoned the offensive at Morton. I knew how annoyed Patton this forced obscurity, and therefore looked forward to the moment when it would be possible to publicize the actions of his army. The screaming newspaper headlines spurred George on. The larger the print, the more desperate he fought. Somewhat earlier, I had promised Hazlitt to lift similar censorship restrictions on his 15th Corps after it took Alençon. On 12 August, I suggested to Wyke that I would also lift the censorship restriction on Patton at the same time as Hazlitt, since by then he should have captured Argentan from the south. Ike laughed and agreed to my proposal, but only with respect to the 15th Corps, refusing to lift the censorship of Patton. "Well, wait for now," he said. "After all the trouble I've had to endure on account of George, there are only a few grey hairs left on my poor old head. No, let George do a bit more work for his favourite headlines." After a few days, Ike relented and the Third Army got noticed in the headlines. George's fame in the United States began to claw its way out of the cubbyhole it had fallen into in Sicily. Shortly before the fall of Paris, following our armies, we moved Eagle Tack from La Vale to the shady town of Chartres, 180 kilometres away. The liaisons were lagging behind the fast-moving columns, and we at Army Group headquarters were faced with the problem of either dragging behind and keeping in telephone contact with Wyke, losing touch with the armies, or moving with the armies and keeping in touch with Ike only by radio. Ike grumbled. He did not share our opinion about the impossibility of maintaining telephone communication with the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, but we had no other choice. We could not lose contact with the front. The lack of telephone communication with the rear made the headquarters of the 21st Army Group even more inaccessible than the headquarters of the High Command. But we did not regret it. At the beginning of August, I moved my campaign office from a modest lorry into a perfectly equipped headquarters trailer half the length of a Pullman wagon. A platform was hinged at the rear, which formed a sort of veranda connecting to the 2.5-ton lorry. This lorry I still used as a flat. When Ike visited our beachhead on the 4th of July, he had to squat in the most uncomfortable position inside the small truck where I lived and worked. "Why don't you give up that damned closet," he said, "and get a handy trailer like Monty?" That's exactly what we wanted. My trailer, fitted up in England according to Hanson's careful instructions, was so richly decorated that I was often ashamed to live in such comfort. 4 plexiglass lamps were built into the ceiling for daylight. A series of fluorescent lights illuminated the map stands along the side walls, and the front of the trailer, finished in mahogany and carpeted, was semicircular in shape and resembled a church altar. Indeed, when Air Marshal Tedder first visited me, he walked over to the railing that partitioned off the room, knelt down on a pew in front of the altar. "Take communion with me, please." In 1947, I tried through various channels to track down this staff trailer. But in the chaos of demobilization, the reporting in the European theatre of war was put into such a confused state that no trace of the trailer could be found. As for the lorry which served as my flat, it was possible to establish that it had been sent to England. A farmer wrote to me that he had purchased the lorry during the sale of surplus American property, and that it served as an excellent shelter for his shepherd in the peat bogs. The next day, on the liberation of Paris, I returned to the command post, housed in a barn near Chartres, after a short flight to Brest. I found Eisenhower perched on the doorstep. Although I could come on very serious business, he still suggested that I take a walk the other morning to Paris and see the city. "Hey, tomorrow is Sunday," he said, "and everyone will be in bed for a long time. We can be in Paris and come back without any fuss." He radioed to Monty and invited him to join us. But Monty apologized and declined. He was too busy with the English advance towards the scene. The next morning it was not yet 8 o'clock when our cars squeezed into a column, advancing along the sleepy boulevards of Chartres. Ike's protective-coloured Cadillac, decorated with French, English and American flags, moved between 2 armoured cars. Seibert was paving the way in his jeep. As we approached Paris, we encountered more and more cyclists. It seemed as if half of Paris that morning had got on their bicycles and gone out of town in search of food. From time to time we signalled as we passed some old-fashioned lorry with big wheels. Its gas generator set poisoning the air with exhaust fumes. Here and there along the road were soldiers of the 4th Division sleeping, wrapped up in their marching blankets and paying no attention to the noise. Jarrow was waiting for us at the corner of a busy street near the Orleans Gate, painted with flags. We drove through Montparnasse, past boulevards riddled with ditches that were supposed to be shelters from bombardment, and headed for the police prefecture occupied by de Gaulle's headquarters. On the broad staircase running from the courtyard all the way up to de Gaulle's chancellery were lined Republican guards in Napoleonic uniforms, with red regimental badges and black patent hats. De Gaulle was waiting for us in his office. A friendly smile appeared on his long, sullen face. It was my first meeting with this rugged soldier of the resistance army, and I could not find in his features anything but grim and unyielding determination. De Gaulle spoke of the urgent need to show the Parisians that this time the Allies are strong enough and will be able to push the Germans into German territory and there destroy them. He proposed to march 1 or 2 of our divisions through the streets of Paris in order to make a proper impression on the Parisians and invigorate them. Ike turned to me and asked what we could do. The plan for the next offensive operation was already ready and provided for the performance of our troops from Paris in the eastern direction. So I replied that perhaps we could lead one of the divisions straight through the Place d'Étoile, rather than sending it in a circular route through the neighbourhood of Paris. "When can we do that?" Ike asked. "Oh, perhaps in 2 or 3 days, I can't say exactly." Accompanied by General Joseph Pierre Koenig, appointed by General de Gaulle as military commandant of Paris. We went to the Boulevard des Invalides, where Napoleon's tomb was located under the gilded dome of the House of Invalides. After a quick look at the tomb, we crossed the Seine and entered the wide Place de la Concorde, then headed towards the verdant Champs-Élysées. A huge tricolor cloth wrapped the Arc de Triomphe from top to bottom. As soon as Eisenhower got out of the car to bow to the tomb of the unknown soldier, a cheering crowd rushed to him. The way back to the car was blocked by the crowd, and it took the intervention of military police to clear the way. But when Ike was within 2 or 3 steps of the saving car door, a huge, dishevelled Frenchman embraced him from behind and covered both cheeks with countless kisses. Ike was floundering, trying to free himself from the embrace, and the surrounding crowd let out frenzied shouts of delight. Cut off from my car, I managed to make my way to one of the jeeps guarding us, where a pretty young woman was whispering something to the driver. A few minutes later, wiping lipstick off my cheeks, I jokingly told Ike that I was happier than he was. I will not dispute your honours, I told him, but will try my luck in the crowd. The 28th Division helped to drag northward our bulwark through Montgomery's front, and then withdrew to the American sector and halted at Versailles, preparing to take part in the coming offensive of the First Army east of the Seine. This division was the most suitable candidate to take part in the forthcoming Allied march through Paris. The day of 29 August was cloudless and quiet. The columns of the 28th Division in full marching order marched down the Champs-Élysées from the Arc de Triomphe to the crowded Place de la Concorde. There, to the sound of the divisional song Khaki Bill, the procession split into 2 columns, and each column headed for its own staging area. What the Parisians mistook for a parade was in reality a tactical transfer of troops to the front. In 26 hours, counting from the time it set out on the march, the division covered the distance from Versailles to the bivouac in the Bois de Boulogne. There it paused to clean off the mud accumulated during 36 days of fighting and marching from uniforms and lorries. Taking advantage of the halt, the division command brought the parade instruction to the troops and gave the battle order to move from the march to the offensive. On this day, Ike was not in Paris. By his absence, he wanted to emphasize that he did not want to offend the British, who could regard our parade as a flirtation with the French. Although we offered Montgomery to join us, we were not at all surprised by his refusal. Eisenhower's tactful act was done with the best of intentions, but it did not soften the hearts of those British who believed that we undeservedly humiliated their prestige. Part of the London press furiously attacked the parade of Americans, which is exactly what we feared, and regarded it as a deliberate undermining of British authority. If de Gaulle had not demanded an immediate demonstration of Allied forces in Paris, I would never have agreed to this parade of American troops. Liberated Paris has become the symbol of free France, and no one is more deserving of the honour of participating in the celebrations in the liberated land than the British people. The authority of the British in Paris, however, was not finally shaken. When the military administration department formed a travelling column to bring food to Paris for the first time, a detachment of English lorries joined in this mission of goodwill. On the windscreen of each British truck flew the British national flag, and on the sides were attached cloths reading, "Food for the people of Paris." The hundreds of American trucks in this convoy entered the city modestly, without flags or banners. In mid-August, Monty and I had our first clash over the strategy to be followed by the Allies east of the Seine. Similar clashes continued between us in the development of plans for subsequent major operations, until the spring of 1945, when Eisenhower finally untied my hands in Remagen and I surrounded the Ruhr. At first, however, our differences were limited to the question of the forthcoming offensive east of the Seine. This question came sooner than we could have anticipated, due to the failure of the enemy offensive at Mortain, which was conceived as a response to our breakthrough in Normandy. We had expected the enemy to create a defensive line on the Seine, but instead a route across France from Paris to the Siegfried Line was opened to us. Eisenhower now had to opt for one of 2 plans for fighting beyond the Seine. One plan involved shifting the centre of gravity of all operations to the American Army. The other favoured British troops, Scheme 34. In the first, or American plan, the emphasis was on hitting the Reach directly from the central part, France through the Saarland with subsequent access to the Rhine near Frankfurt. By 25 August, the Third Army cleared the way to Troyes, located 130 kilometres southeast of Paris and only 240 kilometres from the German border. According to our calculations, to fulfill this plan would require the involvement of the 1st and 3rd American armies. The operation was to be accompanied by an offensive in the auxiliary direction along the Strait Coast to Antwerp by the British and Canadian armies under the command of Montgomery. The second plan, proposed by the British, was to concentrate all our forces in the north to strike through Amiens and Brussels, with our armies had to cover a distance almost twice the route through the Sayre proposed by the Americans. The British insisted on an offensive in the north and for the sake of it were willing to sacrifice the offensive in the Saarland. The main advantage of the American plan, which envisaged a rapid rush to Frankfurt, was that the path of the offensive to the borders of the Reich passed through the area devoid of defensive weapons in the strip of the Third Army. The choice of this direction of the main blow not only gave the opportunity to bypass the fortifications of Metz and cross the Maginot Line, but also to infiltrate through the occupied garrison positions of the Siegfried Line. In addition, in the event of a successful advance of our main forces to the Rhine, the enemy was deprived of the Sayre basin, which is of paramount importance to him. The negative side of this plan was primarily the weakness of the 21st Army Group, Montgomery, which still could not overcome the resistance of enemy divisions in the area of Pas de Calais. If Monty could not advance at the same pace as we did, we were both in danger of finding ourselves with open flanks when moving forward, which was fraught with serious consequences. Our greatest fear was that Montgomery would find his army not strong enough to capture Antwerp. The weather along the coast was deteriorating, and we would very soon find ourselves totally dependent on that port. Moreover, if Monty had failed to clear the coast of Belgium and Holland from the installations for launching aeroplane shells, this failure would almost certainly cause a very unpleasant political resonance in London. The British plan contained a number of very obvious advantages, although its fulfillment involved travelling a greater distance and possibly stubborn enemy resistance. With 2 British armies and 1 American, Montgomery could liberate the Netherlands with minimal risk. This, in turn, might be the rapid capture of Antwerp and the ports on the Straits coast. Antwerp would become an object of the greatest importance as soon as we abandoned our plans to use the ports of Brittany. 2. The occupation of Belgian airfields, which would make it possible to organize direct fighter support for heavy bombers making daylight raids. 3. Liberation of the coast, where we're equipped with launching sites for aeroplane shells from which London was bombarded. At the same time, an advance in the north would take the British armies directly to the Ruhr, from where, as Montgomery later stated, was the best road to Berlin. By putting forward a proposal, the basic gist of which was that Eisenhower should concentrate all his forces on the northern main line, Montgomery was thereby suggesting that Wyke stop Patton's Third Army at the Meuse while he, Montgomery, would rush on to Berlin. This proposal strongly resembled Monty's tactics during the Sicilian campaign, when he had suggested that the American troops confine themselves to defensive action and allow him alone to capture Messina. Anticipating that Eisenhower would be anxious to secure the Channel coast, I put forward a double-strike plan that would combine the positive aspects of both the British and American plans. Instead of throwing Hodges' entire First Army into support of Montgomery's offensive, I suggested to Wyke that we limit our assistance to 1 corps. That will be quite sufficient to support Monty's offensive, I stated. The other corps of the First Army in conjunction with the Third Army were to advance across the Sayre in the direction of the Rhine. Monty, however, did not want to hear about a compromise. He demanded the entire First Army, defending my view of the need to limit American assistance to Montgomery to 1 corps. I did not detract from the importance of his plan of attack in the north. But why does he demand 3 corps? I asked. After all, it is exactly 2 corps more than his actual needs. If only Monty risked to take the offensive, not requiring an overwhelming superiority in force, we could use the 2 remaining corps to strengthen our group advancing on the Rhine south. This strike could then be linked to the actions of the 7th Army, making it possible to encircle also those Germans who had withdrawn from Devers advancing up the Rhine. Assessing the advantages of our plan, we also took into account the possibility of reaching the Rhine, seize the Saar, and interrupt the movement of ships on the Rhine. Here, however, my daring designs stopped. I never thought that we could force the Rhine alone. For if we were to find ourselves on the other side of the Rhine, we could only hold our ground by establishing a vast bridgehead. All those who later argued that Patton could have launched an offensive on Berlin if the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force had not cut the supply of petrol to his army, did not take into account one very important factor. Inside Germany, on the other side of the Rhine, there was still a German army. We had to be reminded of this twice. The first time before the end of this month and the second time on 16 December in the Ardennes. 23 August Eisenhower made a tentative decision in favor of a strike in one direction. In a directive to the 21st Army Group, he ordered Montgomery to make the main strike along the Strait Coast. Monty prevailed in the first clash. I received orders to provide support for the advancing British troops with the forces of all 9 divisions of the First Army. As for the Third Army, it did not remain in place, although our proposal to advance south through Metz by 5 corps was reduced to a diversionary manoeuvre by 3 corps. Having achieved an advantage in the number of troops placed at his disposal, Montgomery could claim an advantage in supply as well. As a result, the 12th Group was ordered to provide all supplies to the First Army in the first place. The Third Army was relegated to the background in matters of supply. Meanwhile, the Third Army was to advance to the Marne, 115 kilometres east of Paris. There it was to prepare for a further offensive with the task of capturing the crossings of the Rhine in the area from Mannheim to Koblenz. However, when giving orders to the Army Group on the offensive, had to reckon with its available supplies. On the other side of the Marne, we could scrape together for the Third Army only the miserable crumbs left from the First Army and from our British colleagues in the north. I was upset, but I did not argue, but simply agreed with Eisenhower's decision. I well understood his desire to seize the Netherlands with its airfields and the ports on the Strait Coast, but I strongly opposed his proposal to give Montgomery all 3 corps of the First Army. 1 corps, I persisted, will be quite enough. Monty, in my opinion, makes also exorbitant demands in the field of supply. However, I soon had to admit that Eisenhower may have been right in deciding to allocate at the disposal of Montgomery 2 more corps, because I underestimated the strength of enemy resistance which faced Monty. If our resistance to the British had been limited to just 1 corps, Monty would never have been able to develop a sufficiently rapid rate of advance, taking advantage of the confusion and demoralization in the enemy's ranks. Once Montgomery's troops began to advance along the coast, he had to leave one division after another in the rear to block German garrisons in the Strait ports. By 10 September, more than a third of his forces were busy eliminating pockets of resistance in our rear. On the other hand, I believe that Monty could have pressed on with more moderate demands for transports. At first he claimed that he could not supply the 21st Army Group unless the Americans reinforced his transports. In order to make up for the lack of transport from the British, we were forced to borrow trucks from Hodges. Then, in order not to delay Hodges' advance, we took the trucks from Patton. As a result, George's offensive was halted for lack of petrol. If Monty had reduced his ammunition demands and worried more about petrol, Patton would have been able to advance further. But Monty stubbornly refused, maybe he was right, to take the risk of even minor resistance if his field depots were not filled with ammunition. I argued desperately with Eisenhower over Monty's excessive supply requests, but could not budge him. Meanwhile, Patton first showed concern, then complained, and finally began to rage as his army's fuel reserves began to dwindle as a result of the ever-increasing shortage of trucks. In order that George might reach and cross the Marne and advance as far as his petrol supplies would allow, we called in the Air Transport Force. From 23 August, patrol began to be delivered by air, but even this small vent was soon closed to us. In his directive, Eisenhower approved Montgomery's plan and ordered the use of airborne troops to clear the way of the offensive northern grouping. The airborne troops were to be dropped in the Belgian city of Tournai, famous for its carpet production, located 20 kilometers east of Lille. Eisenhower hoped with the help of this landing to encircle the 15th Army of the enemy, retreating from the shores of the Pass de Calais. I asked Mike to abandon this plan and give us the opportunity to use aircraft to deliver supplies. The airborne operation was scheduled for 3 September. "We will be in Tournai before you drop this landing." I warned, but Eisenhower stubbornly stood his ground. To what extent Brereton fueled Ike's enthusiasm for the landing operation plan, I do not know. Brereton, who had previously commanded the 9th Air Army, was appointed commander of the newly formed 1st Allied Airborne Army in early August. In addition to transport aircraft, Brereton had the British and American Airborne Corps, each with 2 airborne divisions. Almost from the first day of its creation, this Allied Airborne Army began to display an uncanny ability to invent for itself tasks that were not necessary. But even independently of the incantations of Brereton's staff, Eisenhower had good enough reasons to favour an airborne assault at Tournai. The anti-offensive in this period of confusion and disintegration in the ranks of the enemy was of such great importance But Eisenhower considered it his duty to use every means at his disposal. And since we could assess all the capabilities of the airborne army only after testing it in battle, in the conditions of maneuver warfare, Eisenhower believed that he just presents an opportunity to make this test. Every day more and more units of aircraft C-47 was removed from the transfer of supplies for our group of armies until finally, on 31 August, the number of goods delivered to us by air not reduced to 30 tonnes. Meanwhile, of the 400,000 gallons of petrol for which Patton had submitted a requisition the day before, only 31,000 tonnes had been delivered to his forward depots. By this time, fuel supply disruptions had hampered the Third Army's having no transport aircraft. We could not hope to change the situation. The next day, Patton, like a hurricane, hit our command post from his command post southeast of Paris. "Nurse, damn it, Brad," he pleaded, "give me just 400,000 gallons of petrol, and I'll get you to Germany in 2 days." Although George usually exaggerated even the most optimistic calculations of his staff, this time I could not argue with him. He had already passed through Verdun, which is only 55 kilometers from Metz and some 100 kilometers from Saar, and there were no obstacles on his further route, except for the enemy's abandoned pillboxes on the Siegfried line. But where to get 400,000 gallons of petrol? George might as well have asked me to get the moon out of the sky. Ike's plan to drop an airborne paratrooper at Tournai dashed our last faint hope of supporting Patton's offensive. When the paratroopers land at Tournai, I predicted we will already be waiting for them there. On the evening of 2 September, Hodges' column of tanks reached the suburbs of Tournai, from where the 5 towers of Our Lady's Cathedral were visible. Although Tournai was in the strip of Montgomery's offensive, 10 kilometers from the boundary line, I gave Hodges orders to break through to it and capture the city. I promised Ike that we would be there, and I had to be sure the town was already occupied when I called him. 9:15 AM03. On 3 September, Hansen woke me up to a telegram from Monty, who complained that the American troops in Tournai were blocking the path of the British advancing on Brussels. I contacted the First Army and ordered the duty officer of the Operations Department to withdraw troops from the city. Although we had fulfilled our promise and there was no longer any need for an airborne landing, we were nevertheless unable to make up for the supplies we had received. It was not until 6 September that the daily reports of Lieutenant Colonel Harry Henschel, the officer in charge of airlift, began to show a revival of airlift during the 6 days of inactivity, to which we were forced by Eisenhower's decision to drop the landing at Tournai. We received an average of 823 tons of cargo per day, and the amount of petrol not delivered to us was estimated at 1.5 million gallons, which would have been quite enough for a 4-day march of the Third Army towards the Rhine. While I cannot say that if the Third Army had gained what it lost by the planned landing at Tournai, it would have reached the Rhine early in September, it is quite obvious that Patton would have advanced further if he had gained what he was entitled to. He could probably have passed Metz and entered the Saar. Having suffered heavy losses, we were forced 3 months later to remember the old military rule. To fail to seize an opportunity is to lose it forever. Only on December 2, the Third Army finally broke through to Saar, and that only after a fierce winter offensive through a heavily fortified enemy defense line. Having supported Montgomery's rapid rush northward, Eisenhower took responsibility for the material support of the 21st Army Group, and if necessary, at the expense of American troops. Then, to make sure that our main efforts would be directed to support Monty, Eisenhower established such an order of distribution of incoming supplies between my 2 armies, with the lion's share going to Hodges. Patton was to make his way to the borders of the Reich, content with available resources. The supply of the armies of Montgomery and Hodges had to be carried out in the first place and at any cost, even if it would have to stop the advance of Patton. The logistical crisis that threatened to stop us where the enemy himself was powerless to do so was not the result of a lack of organization in our supply system, but was the inevitable consequence of the unexpectedly rapid pace of the offensive. Even the American Logistics Service, in spite of all its achievements and capabilities, was unable to keep up with our pace. By the end of August, the Third Army had reached Verdun, 500 kilometers from Cherbourg. Even the Red Ball Express system, with its one-way movement of vehicles on roads at high speeds, could not meet the minimum supply requirements of our armies. The turnaround time of vehicles per trip increased to 5 days. This meant that the number of lorries needed to deliver the necessary supplies to the front also had to be increased fivefold. East of Paris, railway services had been restored, but in the area west of the Seine, subjected to fierce Allied air raids, engineering units, working under incredibly difficult conditions, are still rebuilding hundreds of destroyed bridges and laying passageways through bomb-torn marshalling yards. At the sight of these ruins delivered to us, I involuntarily sympathized with von Rundstedt, imagining what an inferno brought down on him by our plane. At the end of August and in September, during the pursuit of the enemy across the fields of France, petrol constituted the bulk of the supplies we received. This was due to the fact that we met on our way only isolated pockets of resistance, rather than deeply echeloned defences, and the consumption of ammunition was greatly reduced, whereas in Normandy an armoured division normally consumed 4 tons of ammunition for every ton of petrol consumed. The ratio was now reversed and ammunition consumption became much less than fuel consumption. As early as 1942, Lord Louis Mountbatten, then Chief of Naval Landing Operations, foresaw that we would face the problem of petrol supply and proposed the laying of a petrol pipeline under the Channel to supply fuel to the invasion army in France. This underwater petrol pipeline, called Pluto, pumped the first gallons of fuel to the Normandy coast on 12 August. But the builders of the petrol pipeline, just as the battalions building the communication line, could not keep up with the rapid pace of our offensive. By the end of August, the petrol pipeline was brought only to Alençon, which was 320 kilometers behind our front. At first, when the fighting east of the Seine unfolded, the Third Army was limited to 2,000 tons of fuel per day by Ike's orders. This fuel was barely enough to meet the needs of an army that was moving forward with almost no resistance. Patton first paid little attention to the fact that he was allocated very little petrol, but as soon as he realized that his interests were being infringed, he lost his temper and came to my command post as furious as an enraged buffalo. When I reminded him of the great needs of the armies operating in the northern direction, he objected quite reasonably that the settlement of all requests for supplies was a matter for higher headquarters. He only cared about the Third Army. He didn't care about the other armies. "Oh, to hell with Hodges and Monty," George roared when he was in a good mood. "We'll win this damn war if you keep the Third Army on wheels." The meagre daily fuel allowance theoretically doomed Patton to complete inactivity. But he still managed to refuel a few tanks with the drops of petrol he had and stubbornly pushed forward. In the Third Army itself, he stopped thousands of vehicles, and for the rest he imposed an ironclad economy of petrol consumption. When George arrived at the Army Group Command post to report, his jeep would usually roll up with an almost empty tank, and he would order his chauffeur to refuel in our park. While Patton continued to move forward, suffering a severe shortage of petrol which should theoretically have stopped him somewhere on the Meuse, Montgomery accused me of violating Ike's order to supply Hodges first. This accusation was not difficult to refute, because the distribution of supplies between the armies was made on the instructions of Ike himself. We strictly carried out his instructions, but at the same time helped Patton to advance by sending to his allotment mostly fuel and only a small amount of ammunition. Although the September supply crisis was inevitable, it did irritate the American soldiers. Infuriated that empty fuel tanks had halted their victorious march, they blamed all their failures on the ill-fated communications zone. Although the communications zone authorities could not have foreseen such a rapid defeat of the enemy, they were nevertheless a very suitable scapegoat. The Communications Zone Command, while heroically trying to avert a supply crisis, had to resort to various tricks that did not help its prestige among the combat commanders. I could not lay the entire blame for our being stuck a stone's throw from the Siegfried Line on the communications zone, but, on the other hand, I could not fully justify it either. The communications zone was partly to blame for the failure that befell us, and the communications zone was represented by General Lee. The somewhat capricious but talented commander of the communications zone, Lieutenant General J. Lee, was Eisenhower's rear guard chief of the entire American Army. Energetic and resourceful commander, outstanding and courageous administrator, Lee, however, suffered from pompousness, which often overshadowed his positive qualities. Lee performed perhaps the most difficult task in the entire European theatre of war, and although he imposed on himself the dry importance of a pedant, but he ensured the supply of troops. Gripped by an ambitious desire to personally manage the supply of troops in France, Lee in early August moved the forward echelon of the headquarters of the communications zone from London to Cherbourg. In order to field his huge command post, He built a barrack town, which required a colossal amount of transport just at a time of acute shortage. Long before the liberation of the French capital, Eisenhower announced that he categorically forbade headquarters to be stationed in Paris and reserved his hotels for troops on leave. But apparently Ike's order did not reach Lee, because on 30 August we learned that the headquarters of the communications zone left their barracks and moved to the comfortable boulevards of Paris. I was annoyed to learn of this pirate raid on Paris hotels, but it infuriated me to think that Lee had loaded his entire headquarters onto cars and dragged it 320 kilometers in the middle of a supply crisis. No matter how carefully the plan for this relocation was developed, such a move could only have a negative impact on the work of the rear agencies under Lee. No one could calculate what cost the relocation of Lee's headquarters to the front, but whatever the damage, the news of the relocation of the headquarters of the communications zone in Paris caused irritation at the front. Soldiers at the front are always jealous of the comfort enjoyed by supply units in the rear. When the infantry learnt that the comforts surrounding the personnel of the zone of communications had been supplemented by the charms of Paris, the consciousness of a perfect injustice was deeply embedded in the soldiers' souls and remained in them until the end of the war.